My name is Michael Goff, and I'm Principal Product Marketing here at Revenera, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, From Digital Ambition to Business Impact, what it really takes to monetize software, data, and AI in intelligent devices. Today, we're joined by VDC Strategy's Executive Vice President, IoT and Industrial Technology, Chris Rommel. Chris is going to explore how intelligent device companies are moving beyond basic connectivity towards software-driven platforms, and why usage data, monetization models, and operational agility now determine whether digital innovation turns into real business impact. Before we get started, though, let's go over a few housekeeping details. First, today's discussion will be roughly 30 to 40 minutes long, and if you have any questions or comments along the way, please add them in the chat tab, and we will try to answer them as we go along or at the end if time allows. Don't worry if we don't get to your questions, we will follow up with you individually after the event. Also, please be sure to check out the Docs tab, where we've shared a number of resources relevant to today's topic. And finally, we will be sending you a link to the recording in the next 48 hours. So with that, let's get started. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me, Michael. Looking forward to today's discussion. Most organizations, I appreciate the setup. As I think about where we are today, I'd say that most organizations are now really good at building digital products, but almost none of them are good at monetizing them. So that, I think, really sets the stage of where the industry is and the discussion for the rest of this session. It's really that tension that drives that dynamic, and we see that directly in our research as well in the discussions we have with a wide variety of device manufacturers. And with that, we'll be sharing some insights from the discussions we've had with engineering leaders, product managers, some senior executives across that broader industrial and embedded engineering space, and try to help everyone understand the gap between what organizations can build and what they can actually charge for the new solutions and innovations they're adding, and where the industry really is headed or should be headed in terms of product investment. And specifically, we'll dig into the AI monetization challenge, because that's a new thing that a lot of folks in the ecosystem are trying to navigate. And that's where we see the gap being most acute. And then we'll dive a little bit further into how business models are changing around it, and how in many cases, the decisions around operational infrastructure and in platforms really become the constraint for organizations. And we'll try to set a framework for different technologies and pathways organizations can consider to if they try to put them in the best position to succeed going forward. And maybe to take a quick step back before I go any further, for those that aren't familiar, who is VDC? We're a leading analyst firm, research and consultancy organization focused on industrial and operational technology markets. And so over the course of this discussion, I'll be pulling in some examples from some conversations I've had with many organizations like you all, as well as a survey that we conducted to help provide some quantitative backing and trend information on the patterns we see at play in the market at large. So with that preamble aside, I think it's important to note that IoT connectivity, that really used to be the finish line for many organizations. That was the aspirational point in the industry. Now it's really just the starting line. To that end, 67% of products are now designed to be IoT connected. That's now 2/3 of the market. Just 3 years ago, in a similar study that we conducted, our surveys were showing about half that number. So when you think about essentially a doubling of IoT functionality and connectivity in a product landscape over just a few years, that's actually quite remarkable given the pace of change in an industry that normally or historically has always moved in much, much longer cycles. So I think that really gets us to the point that I really want to land here for all you as you think about the rest of the discussion. And that's that, IoT connectivity alone, that no longer constitutes digital transformation. The bar has moved, and in many ways, it's moved quite significantly. So what I'm seeing, and I imagine it's consistent with what you all are seeing as well, is that connected devices are evolving into something that's now fundamentally different. we've long been talking about the fact that they're often now software-driven platforms. But now what has changed and what really drives this whole monetization discussion is that the fact that products don't stop delivering value when they ship. They continue to generate value through software upgrade, data-driven services, and analytics that can help customers optimize their operations long after that initial deployment and installation. So that's really what I see as a significant and profound shift in that relationship between manufacturers and their end customers. And that transaction in the past was the relationship. You sold the product, the customer owned it, your ongoing involvement was largely limited to service and warranty. But now that model is being replaced by something that's much more continuous and much more valuable potentially on both sides. But that's only if you get the business model right. And you can take industrial automation, for example. There's an organization that I've worked with that is deploying a robotic welding system, and that's on a production line. And 5 years ago, that conversation was about hardware specs, the repeatability, the footprint, the size of spool, the warranty. Now, that same system can offer remote performance monitoring, predictive maintenance alerts triggered by anomaly detection, in the data in the various dashboards some of the plant managers have to track the throughput and identify any potential bottlenecks. And so that product, it no longer stops creating value or specifically defined value. At one point, you were just selling a labor replacement. Now you're selling something much, much more than that. And when it becomes a platform, and this is true across industries, that a customer relies on operationally day in, day out, and as a source of more direct line of sight and intelligence, that is where it starts to shift. And I think what's really important when we think about translating that product value to monetization and broader digital transformation at large, it's that many times, the majority of times, 78% in fact, these types of discussions, they're engineering-led teams. And so when you put that in the fact that it's not very often the IoT functionality and now AI functionality, it's not necessarily a CIO-driven initiative being handed down from IT. When you have that transformation happening inside of product development organizations, the people in that conversation today, in the rank and file of engineering, are the ones that are architecting the platforms, architecting the change. When you're talking about connectivity, telemetry, software architectures and such, and that is what's shaping ultimately the new monetization models, and why many times organizations need to rethink the platforms and strategies they have up front to connect those various silos between engineering, operations, and ultimately monetization. Ultimately, you can't price what you can't measure. And right now, that measuring, that telemetry, that becomes the new competitive advantage. To me, one of the clearest signals in our research on how aggressively engineering organizations are investing in data and analytics capabilities, you can see it right here. I mean, not just to make better products, but to understand how those products are actually being used in the field, that matters enormously for monetization. And so what we're calling in terms of like usage-aware products, I mean, you can see all these statistics that we have up on the screen, products that are instrumented to then capture real-time data on how customers interact with them or how they're used in field. That's how you know how you can ultimately have a foundational layer for consumption-based or value delivery monetization. Without that usage visibility, ultimately, you're essentially pricing in the dark. And so in practice, as you can see, 46% of the people surveyed now track device activations. You know, they know what's live, what's in use. 45% track feature module usage. 39% track data volume processed, and 38% active users, meaning that, you know, they can understand, you know, various levels of engagement, not just license counts or on the data volume that is especially relevant as AI and analytic workloads grow. And so each of those numbers fundamentally represent a meaningful operational capability. A few years ago, most manufacturers knew almost nothing about what happened to a product after it shipped. Once it left the loading dock, it essentially disappeared. Now nearly half of those that we surveyed have real-time visibility into feature-level engagement. So that's a fundamentally different information environment to ultimately help enable a solid and informed discussion about pricing and product decisions. So if you think about what then becomes possible when you have the data and you identify what features are driving the most value for sometimes your highest value customers, you can then think about pricing accordingly. And you can find also those customers who might be underutilizing capabilities or separately try to proactively drive adoption. And those usage patterns, they could be a path for upsell or just otherwise set the stage for a business case for a new pricing tier based on actual data versus assumptions. So the organizations that made that type of investment, they're building a significant automation advantage over those that haven't. So I want to make something really clear here, and that because it was certainly very clear in our conversations, and that's a basic IoT connectivity and device level usage tracking. That's really becoming table stakes. They're no longer differentiators. And the early movers that have built a real advantage, that window is closing if they don't continue to transform. So it's not whether you have usage data now, it's what you're going to do with it. And I think as we start to look forward around AI, that question becomes especially pointed in terms of where the data gets uncomfortable for some organizations, and also can extend the gap for those organizations that haven't yet thought about how to monetize that functionality in the future. So one thing that's also probably no surprise to any of you is AI is in the market. A lot of people are talking about it. However, the business model for AI and for product engineering organizations is not. So let's be clear about where the industry is with AI. It's not a coming soon story. Now, 41% of the organizations that we surveyed are actively running AI POCs. And so those POCs are rapidly converting into production deployments. It obviously often takes longer than anyone would want, but we're in a stage where 11% now have fully launched features in the market. And yet that same 41% figure shows up again in a different context, and that's that 41% of organizations say they're still experimenting with the monetization approaches to their AI and IoT capabilities. They may have launched the capabilities and the technologies, but they haven't figured out how to charge for it yet in any consistent or really strategic way. So I don't think that symmetry is any sort of coincidence. It really captures the core dynamic in the moment in the market. It's the technology is really running ahead of the business model side. And that's no different than what we saw with IoT. It's now more than ever, given the rate of change in the market, important for organizations broadly to think about the infrastructure or the frameworks they could use to help try to close that gap.
It's almost, sorry. I was about to say, it's
No,
almost
please.
deja vu, right?
Yeah.
Back in the day, when device manufacturers were embedding software into their devices to add value, they weren't necessarily monetizing it. And now, again, we're seeing a similar pattern with AI being embedded into the devices. Why do you think those business model changes are so challenging?
I mean, honestly, that's a big question to unpack, but I think it comes down to, at some cases, that prior discussion, the incentives and org structure. Engineering organizations traditionally are rewarded for shipping features, and so I think that's one element of it. I think more broadly, to be fair, it's also now it's not necessarily even a fair comparison or a failure of execution. I mean, given now how AI capabilities are evolving, to some degree, it has to be kind of test and learn on the monetization side. And I think that becomes the right posture. You don't want to lock in any model before you understand what customers value. But all that said, organizations need the visibility and need a way to actually understand and test to move forward. Otherwise, it just becomes, pushing and shipping more value to your customers without a way to try to extract more value when you're delivering something that is foundationally so much more valuable upon deployment. 39% of organizations have launched AI features and are not charging a single dollar for them. So this ties back to that IoT dynamic redux we were just discussing. So that means those organizations, they're not experimenting with pricing, they're not running a pilot, they're not even offering a discount when they build that business case. They're just not charging at all. They might be having shipped some AI-enabled capabilities when the customers are using, but there's no arrangements around them. And again, some of that could be just a deliberate strategy. Maybe they want to drive adoption, or they just view that as a necessity. It has to be woven in as just a core feature of the next generation of their product. But for many organizations, it's not necessarily a strategy, it's just uncertainty. So to dig further on that, 33% of the organizations we surveyed cited the uncertainty about what customers will actually pay for AI. That's a real dynamic and portion of the market. That AI value can be really hard to attribute. Maybe it's a reduction in defect rates, faster cycle times, lower downtime. Customers can feel the benefit, but maybe they can't quantify it, which could make them resistant to pay for a specific price for it. So I think that conversation requires a bit different of a arrangement and education in the market, both on sales and customers, about selling outcomes. Second is that 25% of the folks we surveyed said that cloud and AI infrastructure costs were rising faster than revenue. So that's another structural problem that can catch organizations off guard as they think about how to continue to innovate and build. And so if you're running inference at scale, that cost structure can be challenging. But if you're pricing the product as a flat subscription or per seat, those infrastructure costs can scale against a revenue base effectively. So as usage grows, margins compress. So that's where you want that a better way to meter and measure and collect commensurate value and revenue from your customers. And then third, 30% cite difficulty measuring AI usage as a key hurdle at large. And that takes us back to that foundation we discussed a couple slides ago. You cannot instrument your AI features to generate any sort of reliable telemetry. If you don't do that, you can't then build any consumption pricing around them. You can't identify the biggest users or even think towards a new tiered threshold, in terms of going from good, better, best, or what have you. You are in the dark. So all of those challenges kind of have that common root, is that they tie back to infrastructure problems that could look like pricing problems, but the answer to each ties back to that telemetry at its core, then tying to entitlement management and analytics to turn that data you have, in many cases, have been collecting since that first IoT push, and turning that into business decisions. So it comes down to a platform investment to try to connect those threads together. The era of one-size-fits-all pricing is over. Many organizations are still trying to fit everything into that good, better, best tier. And if you're overly rigid, you're going to find yourself at a big disadvantage. I mean, given the complexity of AI and IoT monetization and the challenges around it, it probably doesn't surprise you that many of those business models are in flux. And if you look at the slide here, you can see that in 3 years, almost everything is kind of going up in terms of what people are considering or expect to be used as they try to monetize it. And it's really just that proliferation of those different business models being used simultaneously is the giant takeaway. The traditional perpetual license with maintenance, that's actually kind of holding its ground. And it surprised some when we first saw it, but it makes sense in some contexts. I mean, for some industrial products, for example, with long deployment cycles, high switching costs, that remains kind of a viable and customer preferred model. It won't go away, but when you look at what's growing, it's the usage-based, consumption-based models, the various subscriptions, and everything that ultimately ties back to that outcome or value-based pricing shifts. That's where you're going to start to see even more pickup in the future, from my perspective. And for years, if you think about the broader software pricing architectures, it was a tiered packaging, 3 bundles, good, better, best. It worked well when products had kind of finite, relatively static feature sets, but that is generally insufficient for a product that has IoT connectivity, might have AI modules or other usage meter data processing. And when you have a customer base that can range in size from single factories to global manufacturing operations, you can't fit that complexity in just a few SKUs. At least you should not. You want to be able to be an organization to be flexible to the market's needs. And so the implication is really that you need that monetization infrastructure that is flexible enough to support multiple models simultaneously, which really brings us to another operational challenge worth discussion. And that's that the biggest thing slowing down often digital monetization, it's not the product roadmap. It can be, effectively in some cases the back office. And it can be less exciting than talking about the newest whiz-bang AI or IoT capability, but based on our research, it's one of the most significant barriers to the monetization process. Most companies build internal systems for billing and entitlement management, customer portals and such, and that's fine for hardware transactions and if the model is linear and predictable, but that system isn't optimized for today's workflows. It was never really designed for flexible pricing tiers or usage metering or real-time entitlement, consumption-based billing, and so forth. When you run into that modern digital monetization model against a system that is old and built for hardware-focused transactions, you get the bottleneck. You get bottlenecks. You need to layer on manual workarounds, and you spend more time trying to solve an existing problem than actually or unneeded problem than actually executing your next generation strategy. If only 10% of the organizations we surveyed are operating with a commercial monetization platform that's purpose built for digital products, that's just 10%. There's 25% are using a mix of commercial and internal systems, but that screams to me integration overhead, data consistency problems, and so forth. And that doesn't even get into the dynamic of some of the homegrown systems that are out there. And also 28% don't have any real licensing management in place at all. So when you add all of those up, the overwhelming majority of organizations are trying to execute a sophisticated digital monetization strategy now, or at least are aspirationally trying to move in that direction, and they don't have infrastructure built for it. Another example from recent discussions is in a medical device space. There was an organization that had deployed a suite of connected diagnostic devices, and this is in a hospital setting. And they had a lot of rich usage data at one level, utilization rates, procedure volumes, configuration telemetry, at, again, not collecting any patient-sensitive information. And they had everything effectively they needed, at least on the product side, to support a different type of business model. But when they moved to implement that model, they discovered that their systems, their financial systems, weren't necessarily tailored to consume that as any sort of billing input. And so if they were relying back on a super sophisticated spreadsheet maintained by a single person. And that obviously doesn't support the type of organizational flexibility and agility that anyone might want to actually put in place. And so, that's not a product problem per se, or even a strategy one. It's having that infrastructure in place to allow for future change. And so it's very important to think about what you want to unlock from a set of business outcomes perspective and what that requires in terms of smart choices up front. And that really comes into clear picture here. I mean, monetization success is not an accident. It winds up being effectively a design choice or a reflection of a prudent upfront decision. The first thing to understand when you're thinking about this is that the gap between high performing and low performing organizations, we think about it as it pertains to monetization, it's not that product gap. It's those high performers, kind of quote unquote, they don't have better technology. What they have is a different orientation and thought process around monetization. They view it as a strategic capability that's tied to their desire to add more next generation high level functionality to their solutions. And so that requires not only an ongoing investment and cross-functional coordination, tying back to that product engineering led versus CIO led discussion, but it can't be something that gets sorted out at the end of a product development cycle. You need to align on the product, finance, and operations early before, in some cases, final pricing decisions are made, often when you're just speccing things out up front, because that's going to inform how capabilities get packed, how different components are integrated, and what data ultimately needs to flow back to your organization. And you don't want to have any sort of retrofit or delayed time to revenue discussions after the fact. So if you treat monetization almost as a product design decision as you normally would as an engineering organization, that adds a lot of value. If you want to think about consumption-based pricing for that new AI feature, you need to instrument that feature for usage telemetry from day one. And if you want to have any sort of entitlement control logic built in the product itself, you need that data pipeline to be set up. None of that happens automatically. You have to, again, design it in, and then you need that infrastructure to measure usage generally. And that's often the most consistent differentiator for organizations that can execute any modern pricing models and those that can't. You need that full stack from kind of the event collection to the data pipelines, the integration layer that connects the usage data to the entitlement and ultimately billing systems. And then, ultimately, most organizations would want to be able to run any pricing experiments on the idea that this market's moving fast, and so to making guesses, you can actually test things out and experiment and adapt. Kind of that idea of measuring and learning and then, iterating. There's no reason why that can't be applied in some cases to this same space. And, we do see some of this also reflect itself in that survey I mentioned, of organizations that are improving their monetization operations. 42% reported higher revenue capture, 44% said they reported an improved customer experience. And so customers are paying for what they're using in that case, as an example, versus some bundle of things they might not need. Also, 35% report better visibility in their usage, 33% see increased attach rates. That again means customers are buying more of their available capabilities. And all these outcomes come from the operational layer, not just from shipping new features that were probably already good. It's about unlocking that next level of revenue. As we look at where the market is today, certainly your product team can no doubt ship a new feature in a sprint. Maybe but if your pricing team takes 3 months to put a price on it, that's a problem. And effectively, it could be a bit of a competitive liability. And so I think that puts everything in a really important strategic framing here. Digital transformation, as a term, maybe you're not a fan of it, maybe you are, but at its core, that means a business model transformation. With technology being the underlying enabler. It can create that capability, but the technology alone does not create the business value, the revenue does. And the path from capability to revenue, that will directly run through your monetization strategy and what choices you make up front for infrastructure. We know and all agree, intelligent devices are becoming software-driven platforms. Innovation's accelerating. Functionality continues to evolve post-deployment. But of those organizations we survey, it's clear that the monetization strategies are not keeping pace with product innovation. And that that operational infrastructure layer we discussed, that's lagging even further behind. Those two things obviously are tied together. And the stat on the slide that I'd really encourage everyone to take back to the organization and even stress test against what you might see as your own reality is that 41% statistic. 41% say it requires greater than 3 months to implement business model change. Not to decide it, but to implement it. That's after the decision has been made. And on the other end of the spectrum, only 10% of the organizations can execute a pricing change within a week. Now, when you put that against the pace of the AI market as an example, new capabilities are landing in production every few months. Customer expectations are shifting as they see what customers are offering, and your product team is shipping updates in 2-week sprints. In that environment, a 3-month lag between pricing intent and pricing execution is not just an inconvenience, it's a structural disadvantage. If a competitor launches, for example, like just a new AI capability themselves and position it aggressively in the market, and you need a quarter to respond with your own adjustment, that's a challenge that can be hard to recover from. The organizations that will lead in this environment are the ones that will treat pricing agility as a product capability. That's something to invest in, to architect carefully, and hopefully continuously improve upon. And so if you apply that same rigor into feature development, into the evaluation of the infrastructure to support pricing and packaging changes, that's going to position you for success. But that does mean investing and decoupling, that traditional thinking or hardware-driven thinking. And it means building entitlement management systems to support multiple types of models and really creating that muscle, that reflex organizationally to try to figure things out and to have a flexible foundation for change in the future. Because there's a lot of organizations out there, it's clear, that want to change. They have a vision for change, and even are investing in their products for change. But what separates them are the ones that can translate that ambition to business impact, to ultimately the discipline and investments up front to make it all happen. And again, I think those are all investments worth making, but based on data we see, the returns are real. It's just not everyone is doing it yet. So I've already been going for about 30 minutes. I have a couple key takeaways, then we can transition any questions you may have. Just to sum up where we're at and the things we've tried to hit upon in this discussion. I believe there's a really consistent story here, and that's that digital transformation is creating real value in intelligent products. But that capturing that value requires more than just shipping great next generation features. It requires the ability to measure what customers are doing. It requires the organizational agility to evolve pricing models as fast as the market evolves. And some organizations are doing that well, right? 42% are capturing more revenue, 44% cite an improved customer experience. So those numbers are real and they are achievable, but they come from that investment, that discipline, not from just shipping a next generation product. And so there's a list of questions on this slide, and not intended as any sort of rhetoric or even necessarily a challenge, but effectively as a conversation starter. So hopefully some of those resonate with you about what you're thinking about internally. But I'd love to hear about how any of your new goals around products are influencing some of the platform choices you're making, or any questions you may have, generally speaking, about a path forward as you try to evolve the value you provide your organizations and your monetization thereof.
Chris. And we do have one question from Stefan that says, how many pricing changes do you think an end user will accept? He thinks frequent changes might scare away customers. I'll put a little bit of a wrapper around that too. You talk a lot about price experimentation and obviously the challenges of configuring those pricing changes into your system versus having to rebuild it, the value of a commercial system, entitlement management system. and also aligning price with value. And I think that all feeds into, pricing changes and how often you do that, but especially with AI, the costs of that, as you pointed out, SaaS costs, AI costs going up, eating into revenue. It's sort of something that you really need to be on top of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Stefan, I think that's a great question, and I think two things. One, the answer is it kind of depends, and I hate giving answers like that, but you're talking about a wide variety of markets and customer types. And in some ways, it's also a function of the way you're delivering new features and value to your customers. If you are rapidly deploying new software updates and functionalities to your deployed systems, that's different. In a vacuum, yes, it can wreak havoc on relationships if you try to say, oh, every week or month we're changing how we're working together. That's not the intent. There's not value there. I think what's really important to take away is having a foundation or a fabric for experimentation, and that can be with certain lead or beta customers. But beyond that, when you recognize a need for a change, that you can do so rapidly and efficiently and respond to the market needs. Against this backdrop of accelerating innovation, whether it's in the context as we've been talking about for years around IoT or the new acronym with AI, the pace of change is not slowing down. And so by having a platform in place to enable adaptation is incredibly valuable, even aside from all what our research showed us or told us about the ability to drive more revenue when you're using platforms like this.
Points. Thanks, Chris. And you mentioned your research that points to a big gap between companies with commercial monetization platforms and those still with manual or homegrown processes. Do you view that as a big competitive disadvantage?
It certainly can be. I mean, even if you have the best internal team, that becomes a prioritization issue. And we see this repeat itself across the different markets that we follow. It's not a new issue. And you've seen this play out in dynamics around like open source software for years as an example. It's like, yes, you can internally theoretically develop something highly optimized for your business, but you shouldn't have to. And that's beyond the fact that you can make a choice of a commercial solution that's highly supported and pressure tested by many organizations, by people that specifically focus on this. They're not some organization in the test and measurement space that has some part of their internal IT team that's building something out and connecting things internally. There are actual commercial third-party solutions that can address that and allow you to refocus, realign your internal resources on areas internally that can add differentiating value, which isn't already addressed by third-party solutions. So again, I think that's the type of dynamic that should be quite clear to organizations is, paying others to do things that they specialize at. Effectively.
Yeah, 100%, right? I mean, if you're focused on your roadmap and that's where the real value comes to your end customers, you've got to focus on that and not necessarily on, monetization, tech stack, right? Obviously Revenera's, we help manufacturers monetize software in the way that reflects how customers actually use it, whether it's subscriptions, feature-based access, online or offline, but it does give, vendors, device manufacturers a single place to manage and entitle software, across connected, disconnected, edge devices. And then to your point earlier, taking that data and using it to make data-driven decisions about where to invest in your roadmap, churn risk, retention rates, things like that, and pricing and packaging as well.
Exactly.
So I don't see any other questions. So Chris, let me thank you very, very much for your time today. It's always great talking to you and getting your experience, the insights into your survey data. Always great to get your perspectives. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us today. Please be sure to reach out after the webinar if you have any follow-up questions. things that you think about after we hang up. So thank you all for being here today, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everybody.
Thanks all.